If you want to save tape when you're printing labels, there are two options you can use. The first option is to adjust the margin settings, and the second option is to use the chain print function. Now in this video I'll show you both options and also compare the results so that you can choose the option that you prefer. Just a quick note before I start, I only ever teach from my personal experience. So what I demonstrate in this video is based only on my personal experience and what I have found to work well for me. So please feel free to practice the techniques that I'm going to demonstrate and then see what works best for you. So let's start with option 1, adjusting the margin settings. Now margins only work if your label length is set to auto. So we have to first go to label and then we're going to scroll through till we find label length. Then we say OK and make sure that it is on auto. Now there are different label length settings that you can use, but if you want to change the margin settings, then that label length must be set on auto. Now that we've set the label length to auto, we click on OK, and now we're ready to go and set the margins. So let me show you how to adjust them. First of all, once you have typed in the text that you want, you're going to press label, and then you're going to scroll through until you find the word margin. Now once you've found that, you're going to say OK. And you'll see that you have three options, either a full margin, which means that you're going to have a wide margin on the left and on the right of the label. Now that full margin will be 25 millimeters to the right and 25 millimeters to the left of your text. Now if we want to make that margin smaller, then we're going to scroll through until we see the word half. Now half means that when the label prints, you're only going to have half of the 25 millimeters. So you'll have 12.5 millimeters to the left and 12.5 millimeters to the right of the text. Now if you want to have an even smaller margin, then you can choose the narrow option. Now with the narrow option, you're only going to have a very narrow margin with 4 millimeters to the left and 4 millimeters to the right of that text. Here are the printed samples of the full margin, the half margin, and the narrow margin. So from this you'll be able to see that the full margin has got a wider margin on the right and the left of the text, and then the half margin has got a slightly narrower margin on the right and the left, and the narrow margin has the narrowest margin to the left and the right of the text. Now just one important point here about setting your margins. When you print a full margin tape, you'll see that this little beginning bit that the machine needs in order to feed the tape through is incorporated into the full margin. However, when you change to the half margin, you are going to get this little bit of waste in the beginning. And then it'll be the same amount even if you choose the narrow margin. So this little bit in the beginning will always be wasted. So to save tape, I always set my machine to either a narrow margin or a half margin, and that way I save a lot of tape. So just to recap, setting margins so that you can print single labels is a good option. However, you can also print multiple labels. Now let me show you how. Let's take a quick look at how I can add some extra labels onto this list now that I've got my margins set up. So first things first, I've still got my little ABC in there, but now I want to go and add extra words to create extra labels. So I need to have a gap in between each one of the labels. Now I can decide on how big that gap is by using the space bar or I could use the tab function. But in this instance, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to touch the little space bar. So I've decided I'm going to put 2 spaces in between each one of my labels. So I go space, space, and then I'm going to type in my next word. And then I'm going to go space, space again, and then type in my next one. Now I can type as many of those little labels in as I like. And then once I'm happy with that, then I'm just going to tell the machine to print. So I'm going to press print. So here is my finished result, and you'll see that I had my ABC, then there were 2 little spaces in between, then I had my next word, 2 little spaces in between, and then my last word. So now each one of these is going to be a separate label, but because I have those margins set at narrow, you'll see that when I cut it off, I have that very narrow margin at the end and at the beginning. So there's no waste at the end. Now obviously there will always be this bit of waste in the beginning, because that is what the machine needs to be able to feed it past the cutter. So this is the result, and that is how easy it is to actually type in multiple different labels. Now the only thing is that it doesn't put the little dots in between to show you where to cut, but you would just take your little snipping scissors and cut each of these labels apart. Now I know that's a little bit of an extra step, because you obviously can't use the label machine cutter like you do with a single label. However, the fact that you're saving so much tape is really worth that little extra step of cutting in between. Now, just before we have a look at option number 2, my name is Shireen Haynes. I'm the owner of Sew and Craft. Being creative and teaching are my passions, and I've been teaching sewing, craft, decor, digitizing, and how to use sewing and craft machines full-time since 1993. Now, if you would like to know more about my easy-to-follow step-by-step video lessons, please feel free to visit my website, and the link is in the description box below this video. And if you like my content, please feel free to subscribe to my channel and like and share with like-minded people, because this helps me to spread the word that sewing and crafting are fun. Thank you. Now let's take a look at option 2, which is the chain print function. To use the chain print function, we need to tell the machine that we want to use it. So we're going to go to the label button, and we're going to scroll through until we find that word margin. So we'll say OK. Now we know that we have the option of a full, a half, and a narrow margin. But if I press that button again, you'll see that I also have the option to chain print. So because I want to chain print, I'm going to say OK. So now the machine is set to do chain printing. Now what will happen is I need to type in my first label. So I'm going to type in my ABC. Now what I need to do is I need to tell the machine to print this label, but I'm not going to cut it. So I say print, and it's going to ask me how many copies. Now I could print more than one if I wanted to, but I just want to print one, so I'll say print. So the machine has printed it, but now we are not going to cut it. So you'll see there it says feed OK. We don't want it to feed, because we only want it to feed when we are ready to cut. So we just say escape. So now the first label is done. Now I need to get rid of this text. So to get rid of this text, so I can type in the text for the next label, I need to use my backspace button. Now there is a shortcut where you simply hold shift and backspace and it clears all the text, but you've got to be careful not to use that when you are doing chain printing, because it clears the formatting at the same time, which means you're going to lose that chain print function that you had set up. So always when you need to delete, rather use the backspace button. Right, so now I'm ready to type in my next label. So I'm going to type in sewing, and then I'm going to say print. I only want one copy, so I say print. Then it's going to ask me, is it okay to feed? I say no, I don't want to feed, so I must go to escape because I want to put in another label. So I've got to delete the word sewing, so I go backspace, backspace till it's all disappeared, and now I can type in my next label. So I type in the craft, and then I say print. I only want one copy, so print. Now I really do want to cut off because those are the only 3 labels that I want to do. Now obviously I could do a whole lot more, but I would like to compare this option number 2 to option number 1. So I want to finish off here, so I want to cut. So now I can't just cut. I must say feed okay and okay, because what's going to happen is that if I just simply cut it off now, I would cut off in the middle of my last label. So I want the machine to feed that little bit out before I cut. So I say okay, and there it's fed it out. So now I can cut. So here I have the result of the chain print. Now you'll see that with the chain print, the gaps in between each of those labels is bigger than when I set my margins to narrow. So here is the example of where I set the margin to narrow with 2 spaces in between. So here I could control the spacing in between my labels, whereas here with the chain print, the machine decides on the spacing. So if you are looking at purely saving tape, then setting the margins to narrow would be the better option, because you can see that at the end where it cuts off, it also adds on a little bit extra compared to if I had used the option where I set the margin to narrow. So you can see from this that by setting the margin to narrow, you definitely do save a little bit more tape. Now the other advantage of using the narrow margin option is that you can type in all of your labels at once in one long row without having to go back to delete text like you do with the chain printing. Now here is one other thing to take into consideration if you do choose to use the margin option where you set the margin to narrow. If you want to put any of the borders around your text, then it's better to use the chain print, because when you're using the chain print and you add borders, each individual label will have its border placed around it. But if you have just chosen to use the option where you set the margin to narrow, then what will happen is it's going to put the border around all of those labels. So if you're going to be doing labels where there are no borders, then by all means use the option where you adjust the margins to narrow. But if you want to have borders, then you have to choose the chain print option. Now that you know about the 2 options to save tape, you can choose the option that you prefer. Just remember that if you are going to be adding borders, then you must only use the chain print. Now, if you have already purchased the D210 machine from Sew & Craft, you would have got the free step-by-step video lessons on all aspects of the machine, so that you won't have to spend countless hours trying to find videos online that give you hundreds of tiny puzzle pieces that you still have to piece together. Because in these step-by-step videos, all of the pieces have been arranged in a logical step-by-step sequence for you to follow. However, if you have already purchased your machine elsewhere, but you would like to get the lessons, please find the link to those in the description box below this video, because for about the same price as a cup of coffee, you will then have access to all of the lessons, which include how to use the functions of the machine, along with extra hints and tips like the ones in this video. You will also get to use all of the amazing features of your machine.